Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from USC Visions and Voices, the Arts and Humanities Initiative. My name is Marie Renvelez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a cisgendered woman, Asian American, Filipino with tan skin, a round face, wavy ear length, black hair, wearing rounded brown glasses, a beige sweater, and I'm standing in my small home office space in front of a white wall with some Visions and Voices artwork. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Infecting Rights, a lecture by Dr. Kate Gilmore. We have people tuning in from across the country and around the world today. And at Visions and Voices, we believe it's important to open our events by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we share. By presenting lectures like the one we have today, part of the work that we do is to make the invisible visible. The Visions and Voices program is based at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and we acknowledge that both the University Park campus and the Health Sciences campus were built on the ancestral and sacred lands of the Tongva, Chumash, and Kizh nations. We honor them and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and we pay respect to their continued survival and contributions to our society. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free and slave labor of Black people. We share these acknowledgements to raise awareness about the histories that are too often erased or forgotten, to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, and to recognize our place in this history. We invite you to help us continue this practice of honoring Indigenous land and people. So in the chat, please share the names of the Indigenous lands that you're on. And if you don't know, we recommend looking it up at native-land.ca. We have put the link in the chat. Thank you. I would now like to hand this off to the amazing people who have worked hard to bring this event with Dr. Gilmore to you today. So please welcome the director of the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health, Professor Sophia Gruskin.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Marie, and welcome everyone to the third of this year's Medical Humanities, Arts, and Ethics lectures. The first two lectures were amazing, not only in helping us to think through the relationships between health and human rights, but in terms of what these linkages can mean for addressing some of the most complex issues facing the world in these really complex times. Today's going to be no different. In fact, I would say today is the icing on the cake. Today's talk is presented under the auspices of the university's Visions and Voices program. And I really have to begin by thanking Marie and actually the entire Visions and Voices team for their dedication in helping us to deliver today's session. I also want to do some other thank yous. I really want to thank the fabulous Keck audiovisual experts and my wonderful faculty co-organizers, Pam Schaff, Alex Capron, Ron Benari, and Erica Wright, as well as the Keck School's HEAL program, Humanities, Ethics, Economics, Art, and Law, the USC Pacific Center for Health Policy and Ethics, and the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. In our two previous talks, we heard first from Colleen Kraft, a past president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, whose advocacy for humane treatment of child refugees detained at our border is, I think, legendary at this point. And we heard from Homer Venters, a nationally and internationally recognized expert on health and human rights, whose work on behalf of the more than 2 million Americans held in prison and jails is inspirational. I urge you all to go back and see these on YouTube because they're really amazing. They were incredibly motivating, and they showed how awareness of human rights, whether manifest in national or international laws and institutions, or as they exist in reality on the street and in real people's lives, really matter. And really what this awareness of human rights can do to move us as a community and globally to address the injustices and inequalities that we see everywhere and that profoundly affect health and well-being. And this, even in the context of COVID. So it's only fitting that today, March 11th, is the day that everything changed, the day COVID was declared a global pandemic, that we hear from Kate Gilmore on infecting rights. The issue is that while COVID has and continues to unveil our common humanity, the virus has also and most often resulted in abuses and violations of human rights, often justified in the name of COVID. And this in pretty much every country in the world, rights have been infected. Kate is going to speak to us now about how this global public health crisis, exacerbated by racism and misogyny, has further undermined human rights. But I'm also counting on her to help us think about what's next, what we can do wherever it is that we sit, whether at USC or across the world. And before giving her the floor, let me just say a few things about Kate Gilmore. Kate just recently completed 5 years as the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she has amazing experience in strategic leadership with the UN, with governments, with non-governmental organizations. She's been Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director for programs within UNFPA, the Australian Director and then Executive Deputy Secretary General of Amnesty International. And now in her spare time, she's a fellow with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and chair of the Board of Trustees for the International Planned Parenthood Federation. She's amazing. She's an inspiration, and not least because of time zone issues. I have to confess, she's giving this talk, if I'm not mistaken, at 1 a.m. her time. But more seriously, her work is testament to the fact that rights are not abstractions. They are means for focusing and aligning our efforts from the individual to the institutional. And with that, it's my immense privilege to invite Kate Gilmore, my colleague, my friend, and inspiration, to present her talk. She's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for some questions. You can submit questions at any time through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Welcome, Kate, you amazing human being. Thank you for being with us today.
My goodness, thank you. Lovely Sophia, my dear friend and inspiration in turn. Thank you to the USC Visions and Voices programs. Thank you also to Professor Capron, who kindly offered me the privilege of this invitation. It's a great joy to be with you. Friends, scientists had gamed it out. Policymakers had regulated for it. Experts wrote and prepared manuals on it. Public health practitioners were taught it. Government authorities rehearsed it. International agreements were struck on it. Legally binding obligations defined and detailed it. And even had filmmakers who had scripted it. And yet the widespread chaos, callousness, casualness that have characterized unfair, unjust, unscientific public policy responses to COVID-19 underscore just how we chose not to be ready for it. Seen through the lens of human rights, that one pandemic has wrought many contagions. What do I mean by human rights? I mean the normative agenda built up and elaborated upon over these past 7 decades. I mean human rights as a technical discipline of norms, laws, and standards, not merely as ethereal, subjective values of Western liberal order. I mean the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, struck initially by 48 countries, but which, thanks to independence movements, have since cascaded into post-colonial constitutions throughout the 190 plus member states of the UN today. Human rights, which are an operating manual, if you like, for what it means to be human and to be treated as such. If medical science codifies our physical cells, anatomy, physiology, musculature, human rights codify the intangibles of our inherent dignity, the ways in which the human family, the ways in which as members of the human family, each of us is precious, unique, equal. By human rights, I mean declarations, treaties, and conventions whose obligations, being legally binding on governments, establish the freedoms and protections to which we are all entitled, the best and the worst of us, each and every one of us, to the exclusion of none of us, in the interests of all of us. Seen through those lenses, it becomes clear that public policy responses to COVID-19 have infected so much more than only our physical selves. 12 months on, the evidence globally is a telltale of turpitude and treachery by tyrant and technocrat. New baselines of bigotry set deep into our biopolitics, negligence and neglect shaping a new necropolitic, profit-making and profiteering, prospering from poor public policy, the messy, often malevolent makings of a melange of the medical with the mendacious and the mercenary. Oh my goodness. We should have known. Well, we did know, and not just thanks to the scientists who had forewarned, the epidemiologists who had avowed, the environmentalists and polyglots who had pronounced, but because of what historians had heralded. Watch out. We have been here before. But we discover with 2020 vision that for all our 21st century progress, for all the confidence, nay, arrogance of our technologies and discoveries, means and methods, under weight of global crisis, we have stumbled yet again onto familiar ground. Faced with pandemic's plentiful pathogens, those in particular with the privilege, power and position to do otherwise, have manufactured instead more inequality and exclusion, more racism and xenophobia, more misogyny, more aporophobia, more homophobia. Those were public policy choices, not a pathogen's diktats, that have caused the colour of your skin to be determinative of your exposure to the virus and your prognosis, even as the rest of us became even more dependent on your labour, that saw little to no corrective counterbalance put in place to compensate for how your social status would be determinative of your health status under COVID and your access to healthcare, that saw the gender with which you were deemed born and that into which you then emerged treated as if somehow irrelevant, although clearly determinative of your personal safety and security, meaning that across tens of countries around the world, provision of sexual and reproductive health services, although essential, was downgraded and abstracted, imperiling life and health and well-being for millions, driving up deliberately unplanned pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and otherwise preventable pregnancy-related deaths, meaning lockdowns that ended up locking in for greater exposure still those at gravest risk of child abuse and gender-based violence, meaning utter policy irrelevancy to slum dwellers, to residents of population-dense informal settlements, to those for whom social distancing is simply too distant a possibility, meaning that those who had no means by which to comply with the stay-at-home directives, the homeless, people on the move, seasonal workers, informal workers, would live not merely without adequate shelter, but under intensified threat of being locked up for breaking curfews they could not keep, for failures to lock down in options from which they were locked out, meaning that the police were equipped like soldiers and essential workers wore garbage bags, meaning that across the world, the poor declared, we may survive the virus, but we will not survive this worsening poverty, meaning that over these past 12 months, profiteers could grow more profitable, the relatively more secure, relatively more safe, the relatively privileged, more privileged still. This coronavirus has no special hatred for the poor or those excluded from dominant identity. It is not racist or homophobic, misogynist or ageist or disableist. It is not xenophobic. It has no hunger to stifle dissent or inclination of treachery towards truth, fact and science. But our public policy responses to it have had. Rather than do as universal human rights oblige, protect and respect, reinforce and release, intact and unafraid, every ounce of human talent and energy available to the cause of effective COVID response, under administrations of hatefulness, disregard and disrespect, the supremacist standpoint and suppressionist action have served to stifle, shrivel and shrink prospects for the most, while elevating the pre-existing advantages of the fewest, depriving us all of the best that we are, denying us all the best that we could have done, meaning that we all failed to be the best that we could be. Policymakers knew the death toll would be disproportionately higher among poor and marginalized communities, that millions would be made more vulnerable, not by any reason innate to them, but because they were locked deep already into historical, social and structural inequalities. They knew, should have known, but did not act to minimize that entirely foreseeable pattern of morbidity and mortality, which by way of example only saw in one mere year more American lives lost than fell on the battlefields of both world wars and Vietnam combined. Globally, 2.6 million deaths and the end not yet in sight, given we are vaccinating against only some pathogens. We have to conclude, for where else shall reason take us, that administrators, among them those of some of the most wealthy of countries, chose to conclude that only some lives were worth the effort and money required to save them. Migrants queuing at the world's borders, prisoners stacked high in the world's prison cells, slum dwellers toe to toe in the world's favelas. So many lives mattered far less, if they mattered at all. The protest that Black Lives Matter, all the more essential because once again, Black deaths did not or mattered less. Friends, we're not born ready, prêt-à-manger, to detest the differences we discern, those typologies of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, of religion and linguistics are but the fabrication of our collective imagination across them. All are of our making, and by corollary, each can be unmade. But none has a role in a truly sustainable recovery, although all have been present in our unraveling. Each an unconscionable impediment, a barrier to effective response, measures more of our incompetence, signifiers of our incapability, evidence too of the fragility of our human infrastructure, obstacles of our own making to what is needed to save ourselves, including mostly, if not always, from ourselves. COVID responses spread these other pre-existing contagions further and wider, morphing pre-existing inequality of opportunity into inequality of public regard, twisting into an inequality of respect, descending into an inequality of protection that manifested in inequality, even in death, in unequal deaths. We were warned from as far back as ancient Roman law and its concept of homo sacer. Those whose deaths are deemed to be of no value to the gods, those who with impunity may be allowed to die, slowly or quickly, without cause for concern, deaths unworthy of prevention, record, or commemoration. Homo sacer. 2020's homo sacer were on public display as matters of public debate. One journalist concluded, as at first reportedly the UK's Downing Street aides did, that the cost of lockdowns to prolong the lives of a few 100,000 mostly elderly people is an irresponsible use of taxpayers' money. Like-minded pundits in faux self-exoneration claimed, and if that means I die, so be it. The same, incidentally, who, like certain science-defying presidents, did not offer then surrender of their private access to the best medical care that public money can buy, or who, in ugly scramble, didn't push others out of the way to secure vaccinations for themselves first. So how do we manage to allow indignity to be added rather than relieved in the death, grief, and mourning that this pandemic has left in its wake? In Antigone, 5th century BCE, playwright Sophocles frames funeral rites as matters of principle that no government can override. Millennia later, international law asserts dignity for the dead and dying as an elementary consideration of humanity, even more exacting in peace than in war, and in war it is essential. Families' final farewells never made. The frontline workers left unaided to be the ones to make those last goodbyes. The bodies piled up in corridors, found stacked in caterers' refrigerators on the backs of freezer trucks. The mass graves with gravestones not erected, the names of the dead barely recorded, the last rites never read, the funeral ceremonies that never came, the Shiva never sat. To have arrived too late for the benefit of so many at the protocols and procedures to ensure a modicum of dignity in death and dying, to afford the opportunity and space and means by which to honour passage from a loved life to a dignified death. In COVID times, pandemic response so infected respect for fundamental human rights that even in death and in the processes of loss and grief and memorialization too, so often inequality and thus inhumanity prevailed. Come on, we knew, we should have known. We should have known that, like its predecessors, the COVID pandemic would cause strongest along society's gravest fault lines, that those at greatest risk would be those already most marginalized, that those likely to lose the most would be those who had the least, that those who, for their identity, face stigma, exclusion, and discrimination, that they would bear the brunt. We have known, from the time of Columbus at least, and across 400 years of slave trade, contagion to be the constant consort of colonization, devastating indigenous and enslaved peoples in the interest of Europeans, carried into the Americas and Africa as people, precious stones, gold, and coffee were carried out. In plague, under contagion, reification of pre-existing race, class, and gender strata, deepening the fault lines of injustice, the cracks and crevices that are grave inequalities, whose cruelties and inefficiencies mar and scar our human communities we knew. Yes, ours is a health crisis wrought in globalization rather than colonization, likely caused by a man-made environmental crisis, but most certainly worsened by a man-made inequality crisis. Intermingling crises, all so poorly managed that at the heart of our response to them, there is now a human rights catastrophe. For under guise and shadow of COVID response, so many other pathogens have become more epidemic. At the hands of leaders who, around the globe, have sought to strengthen autocratic rule, dismantle democratic and legal checks and balances, elude accountability for their failings, the murderous policies of Duterte in the Philippines, of the mafia military of Myanmar, of the bully boy barons of Belarus, the malicious fantasist policies of Bolsonaro's Brazil, the genocidal practices of Xi Jinping's China against the Uyghur, and its suppression brutally of activists in Hong Kong, the Ugandan police hunting down of LGBTI persons, Putin's poisoning of political opponents, the white supremacist conspiracies festered by the US political classes all flourished further under response to this pandemic. But we must face up to it all, that such bigotry and greed, prejudice and exclusions, supremacist thought and suppressionist action shred capacity, imagination and resilience that we require to also recover well and now to build back better. For build back we will, but we will not return. And where we arrive may be made even worse. After 9/11, we built back through a war on terror that spread a contagion of hyper-securitization, eating away at privacy, demonizing Muslims, expanding state powers, quashing dissent. Building back from the 2008 financial crisis, we bailed out big banks and big business. And from that welfare for the wealthy, left ordinary people mired in a decade of economic austerity, billionaires' fortunes doubling, fossil fuel emissions rebounding, while real wages barely increased and inequality deepened and spread at record pace. So the conundrum before us is that combined climate crisis, conflict, contagion and corruption are such that if our recovery is not disruptive of our previous order of things, then recover we may, but progress we will not. Change after cruel change might be inevitable, but progress most certainly isn't. Human rights progress did come with the recovery from the 14th century's Black Death plague, but only because there were those who resisted return to the worst of what had been and who sought to make the most of what was yet to become. They leveraged the new reality that there were not enough workers left to cultivate the land, and as peasant leaders organized and campaigned successfully for higher wages and lower rents. And in doing so, they ushered in the end of pre-plague feudal systems. Progressive passage past COVID, from response to reduction to recovery, is not inevitable. And that may not even be the itinerary we need. What we do need is the imagination and the courage to choose rather to rethink and reset, not merely to recover. The catastrophe that led to World War I, historian Margaret Macmillan explains, was first a failure of imagination in not foreseeing how destructive such conflict would be, and second, a lack of courage to stand up to those who said there was no choice left but to go to war. Friends, there are always choices, and for us, grave choices loom large. Will we choose to collaborate, coordinate, and cooperate globally to subvert the crisis of COVID-entrenched inequality while tackling too the climate emergency wrought by our unseeing and greedy consumption? Or like so many who failed before us, will we too lack the imagination and the courage essential for these better policy choices to be made? How might we infect the public domain options that support those choices so that they be far more empirically loyal, more human rights based, more global in reach, for more equal and sustainable outcomes? If a solution is not in view or seems impossible to create, spend more time framing the problem correctly. And until we make a big, fat, hairy problem out of greed on the one hand and bigotry on the other, and then repurpose public policy, multilateralism, good governance, the rule of law, and public and private conduct accordingly, the end for inequality rooted in discrimination and transformation of unsustainable consumption rooted in privilege will not be found. even though that is exactly the reset that this world and our poor planet needs right now, exactly what we must do to prevent more of the same and worse. In those tasks, we need your help. The Academy, its knowledge absorbers, producers, and transmitters, whose enriching interface with the privileged classes must also be reset, to enable us all to rethink, reframe, and recover in a thorough and equitable manner. Reset for us to be made braver, less passive, not merely equipped to fulfill ambitious dreams of individual achievement, but ambitious commitments to collective interest. Reset to destabilize the settled order of things, not for personal advantage or private success, but for better protection and enhancement of our global commons. Friends, multifaceted, interlinked, mutually reinforcing crises will not be overcome unless and until we accelerate and expand more systematic, multidisciplined, interdisciplined approaches, until we motivate more intentional and creative synthesis across knowledge sets, expertise, and innovation. More of the kind of thought leadership that the sponsors of this event today have explored. The traditional and continued atomization of knowledge and more conventional epistemics of deep but thin or siloed expertise will be contributive to the best solutions, but they will not lead us there. More urgently than any other skill or comprehension, our need now is for adept collaborators where we have made competitors, for strong socializers where we have had only individualists, for canny redistributors where we have had acquisitors, for robust rebuilders where we have had but extractors and expansionists, for cooperators where we have had consumers. There's an old tale of a grandfather who says to his grandchild, "There's a battle between two wolves inside me. One is evil, arrogant, ego, lies and despair. The other is good, is hope, compassion, courage and truth. That battle is inside us all." And the grandchild asks, "Which wolf wins?" The grandfather replies, "The one you feed." We need, including from the Academy, nourishment for our better wolves, nurture and equipment for our better angels. Yep, it's tough. It's tough to even imagine that something other than country, corporate, and individual self-interest could be North Star on the path we'll trudge up out of this pandemic. But that hard work must be done. We must make it a conscious task and be disciplined about it, multidisciplined. But in that indispensable labor, we can take heart that others have traveled such roads before us, proving by their effort and their courage and their imagination that the improbable can be made more possible. Mesopotamia's 6th century BCE Cyrus cylinder, India's 1st century Ashoka pillar, Sub-Saharan Africa's 13th century Mandan Charter, Finland's 18th century defense of press freedom, the 19th century anti-slavery struggle, the 20th century independence struggles, the 21st century Black Lives Matter and #MeToo movements, down the ages, across cultures, faiths and traditions, we the peoples have hungered for food. We thirst for water, but we have longed too for justice. And there have been always those who labor courageously towards realization of that principle, which, as framed at the founding of the modern international system, reads, "Born we all are, free and equal in dignity and in rights." Rights which were positioned as central in the Build Back Better after World War II's decimations wrought by Holocaust and nuclear bomb. Rights whose details and application are now elaborated in the jurisprudence of 100 nations' jurisdictions, in UN resolution after resolution, in recommendation by recommendation of independent human rights experts, of UN treaty bodies. Don't say you didn't know. Do know that today none of us is without that human rights knowledge or its advice, that none of us is without its example or its inspiration, that none of us is merely alone. So when you choose to exercise reason where others fester fear, or if you choose to act in compassion, not merely for ambition, if you opt for the strictures of redistribution of wealth rather than its accumulations, if you accept limits to your freedoms, but only so that in their exercise you may harm no other, if you too would chafe and writhe against the wire drawn tight around their necks by bigotry, prejudice, and by hate, if you too would bite down hard on those global gags that would silence or stifle or thwart just because of who you are or where you were born or whom you love, if you also would choose to stand up and speak out, not only when your rights are wronged, but when hers are too, then take heart. You're not alone. Medical student Steve Biko, imprisoned and beaten to death for organising resistance to segregated healthcare under apartheid, whose very origins were rooted deep in South Africa's recovery from that same century's early epidemic of bubonic plague. Physician Judith MacKay, the first to speak out against tobacco companies in the 1960s, only to be called psychotic human garbage and a power-lusting piece of meat by the multinational companies in their campaigns to discredit her research. Dr. Lee Ling, who died at the beginning of last year in Wuhan, aged 33, having also endured threats and intimidation for speaking out about a mysterious spreading pandemic, pneumonia. The police captain who last month in a Moscow suburb explained how he would rather resign than obey orders to detain or restrain protesters against corruption and impunity. "I am ashamed to wear this uniform because I realize it is covered in blood," he said, tossing it into a dumpster. The nun who just this month knelt on her own, all alone, before the raised machine guns of the Burmese army, begging them to shoot her rather than mow down the students protesting against the military coup. By the powerful use that they made of what little power they had, and incidentally of their professions too, we do know, you should know, that for all the reasons that we must, if we too stand up to do likewise, to do what is comparable, you are not alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was, oops. Thank you, Kate, and I apologize for not starting my video. I was just blown away by that amazing talk. You have been called, as I know you know, but others may not know, the slam poet of health and human rights. And it's not just your thoughts, but it's your words and how you put words together that get us thinking and hopefully reacting. And what I'm really struck with now, I mean, there are some questions that have come in and hopefully more questions will come in, but my thing is, again, I'm kind of blown away by your way you put your thoughts together, but I'm trying to think, where do we go from here? And how do we think about the future? Where do we go, I guess, to feed the wolf that we want? And, what would you say is the first thing for students, for activists? What is the first thing we need to think about to try to build towards this better place?
What I think we can see from powerful examples known and many that we don't know of is that if each of us takes stock, considers what our assets are and what our privileges are and what our opportunities are, if we consciously take account of those and then think, what recalibration might I be able to make in order to walk that path which the good wolf in us might choose, but then to think about how to reach out to someone else to do that with them as well, how to collaborate, how to build community in response, in resistance, in reset. That for me will be absolutely key. Now, amongst those online, some of the brightest thinkers, early in careers that will be brilliant, who can make fantastic and will make fantastic contributions. The challenge will be, could we reframe those journeys towards a collective purpose, not only an individual achievement? Could we reset our thinkings and our definitions of success so that result valued would be to do with less, to have less, in order that we can sustain more? Are there those online who can help us make a big fat hairy problem of greed which and consumption, which is almost nowhere in the international agenda anywhere? There's some fascinating work coming from economists in that regard, but we're going to need a public policy discourse to dismantle the sense that of thrusting ambition to own more, to be wealthier, to acquire and to consume. And it's nowhere. These are things which we can destabilize, distort and reset, but not if we don't put our minds to it, and indeed the best minds. My challenge is, and the trouble is, where might we be educated in order to do that sort of disruptive thinking? Where are the universities of the dissident, of the disruptor and of the disturber? Of course, we know dissidence, disruption and disturbance have come always from student bodies, but how might we foster that, formalize it, make it more systematic? And for goodness sake, we've got to accelerate it. We have so little time now, I believe.
Thanks. It's really hard. I kind of want to go down that path, but I see questions that take us down a different path. So I'm going to take us down a different path, but I think we'll probably come back to this set of thoughts as well. So one, I think, really lovely question that's come in, which is, if a year ago, the president of a country had asked you which policies she should adopt or absolutely avoid in responding to this newly announced pandemic, what, in hindsight, would you or should we have told her?
There are only two things that were going to be important. Well, no, that we could have done or made much more important. One was loyalty to science, fact, and truth. Absolute, and to have the chutzpah to be factful and truthful with the population. But secondly, to see inequality as the gravest threat to sustainable health outcomes from the crisis. Even 12 months ago, it was clear that if we had put inequalities at the center of the response, we could have achieved a fundamentally different outcome, and we could have avoided the horrendous unraveling and the cruelty and repression that has occurred under the shadow of these poor quality, often very malicious responses.
And do you think that there's approaches to thinking about addressing those now that we should be dealing with?
I think there is not enough conversation or discussion about the spread of attack on science and fact. I don't think it's being framed adequately as a human rights abuse, which it is. It's quite clear in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we have a right to enjoy the benefits of science and of the best of science to advance our dignity. And I believe there has been a preponderance of governments who have thought otherwise and should be held accountable for it. And it's quite clear that we didn't think about what a vector bigotry, prejudice, and inequality would be for the disease. I mean, that's incompetence. I mean, it's beyond me why those things are not being framed in those terms. I suspect it is because people are not working at a level now of strategic reflection. I think we're still in policy panic. And we're going to have to find our pathway out of policy panic and into a deeper, faster strategic reflection. In that, the international community has a very important role to play, actually. It has in the past and on other issues offered another layer or another resource, if you like, for this sort of more global thinking out of the detail and the dynamics of domestic politics. But frankly, the UN has failed too.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. You know, it's another question has come in that seems to move nicely with this, which is that it feels like a lot of the reopening policies that are happening here in the US, if we're honest about it, are based solely on economic needs and not necessarily focused on what's best for the people of our state or of our country. Are there global leaders whose actions and policies during COVID should be modeled more, should be given more positive attention, that we should look to in terms of how it is that they understand and engage with both health and human rights?
I think crudely we can say that women leaders came out far better. That the best of policies seem to have been by coincidence or consequence, where women have been in power. Actually, I think empirically we can say so. But is anyone in command of the interface between pandemic, erosion of biodiversity, destruction of natural environment, and global warming? No, and they're not. And it so reminds me of what we've seen actually among our leaders when it comes to managing hate speech in social media and finding ways to create a human rights governance in the digital age. Our leaders are incompetent in the face of this crisis. They're incompetent. And I would go so far as to say part of the problem is the demography, not just by gender, but by age. You know, it's clear that the moment in our lives where we're most innovative, brave, not always perhaps wisest, but can be most daring in our thinking is under 30. You know, the median age of parliamentarians is 53. The median age of the world's leaders is even higher. Today, youth is a competency that we need at the table of decision making. And here's a third gap in normative thinking. Where is the succession planning? Where is the intergenerational promise that people like me will shut up and get off the get off the pot and let someone else sit there? You know, bring in a generation nimble enough, synaptically powerful enough to sit at the interfaces of, literally at the synapses between at currently dismembered sets of knowledge, and remember the interplay between inequality, injustice, economy, consumption, greed, and bigotry, and find that reframe, reset that we desperately need. Why isn't there a conference on a global scale being convened by leaders honestly saying we've blown it and we need to usher in quickly a new generation of leaders more nimble and astute about matters of environmentalism in the digital age and new ways of living with less?
I mean, it really opens up then our roles as universities and what role we should play in that conversation. And I wonder, as you're talking, whether it means that there's a different role for universities than there has been in terms of thinking about how do we prepare the next generations for the future, not only in terms of how we have thought the world is, but where it is that we want the world to go.
Completely. You put it beautifully. And that, you see, this is why I think there is a reframing, resetting, reforming project here, and which is why I was thinking we've called the problem incorrectly, or we've called the project incorrectly, and I think without the best of our minds, the freshest minds, and without all the access to all the wisdom of knowledge to date, more aligned to saving us from ourselves rather than reproducing the selves we've been, then frankly, the Academy will have betrayed its original intent and its original design. And that's deeply disturbing. And I just want us to notice the Academy is in a unique conversation with privilege. It's both a way or a pathway to privilege, and it has in its audience, its constituency, those who are privileged. And if we can't say, instead of making a problem of the poor, make a problem of wealth, we're going to fail. If we can't allow ourselves to make a problem of being white instead of, confecting all sorts of imaginary about the problems of being, as if there are problems inherent in being Black. I mean, just as we had to move from the idea that women were vulnerable and confront the problems of masculinity. I mean, we have done it before for other things, but it's that reframing that we need a lot of help with. And we need a whole cadre of committed, intelligent beings who are going to hold positions of authority to be with us in that rethink.
So a question has come in. How is it that we should then be thinking about those who represent and benefit from systems that are rooted in white male supremacy and patriarchy? How do we work with them to act responsibly?
This is the most beautiful question. And I share your excitement about it, because what if we said, we saw that as an absence of something, or a lack of knowledge of something, or as a state of being unskilled? What if we shaped the problem around it as being one for which the answer might be new competencies, new understandings, new ways of finding identity? I, as a feminist, and an old feminist at that, I can be troubled by aspects of the shift in our language around gender. But what's been beautiful, and at times troubling though, but what's been beautiful is the sense of great, literally, fluidity, porousness, permeability in the category. And the sense that I have found myself influenced by much younger and brighter thinkers of, embracing a much less binary nature around my own understanding of what it means to be woman, even though I still struggle a bit with the concept that people getting pregnant as opposed to women. I'm signaling my own struggle with exactly the same sort of thing. What I do know is that these old rigid categories are not natural. There's nothing about it inevitable. They can be broken down, they can be deconstructed and therefore reconstructed to be something more generous, more compassionate, to feed the good wolf. And we know that is true for men. It must become much truer for those of us who are white. It has to be made the case for those of us who are wealthy. And you know, we at the moment don't have the instruments, tools, and terms for that, but we've got to get them on scale and up to pace as best we can, quickly.
I fear that we are so quickly, and we've moved so quickly to being at the end of our time. And it's been an amazing conversation. And honestly, I feel like it's a conversation that we could just keep going. So I think I need to, it kills me, but I think I need to close now. And I think that what I need to do is to thank everybody who joined us this evening. I need to thank the excellent questions that came in, even if I butchered some of them, but I really want to congratulate the questions. And Kate, really just to thank you for your good humor, your substantive engagement in the responses, and for this kind of amazing, informative, important exploration of these issues in language that I think we can all hold and keep close. I just want to close by saying this was an incredibly moving and important event. I want to thank everybody. We are always striving to improve these events, so please everyone fill out the evaluation that you'll receive by email. And just goodbye to everyone. Please stay safe and let's work together towards health and human rights. Thank you so much.